8 of Frontier Justice in the West. This week we're going to be talking about the cow towns and the railroads and law and order from or through, or how we found law and order, how we got to a place to where we wanted to establish law and order. So let's start with the end of the war to end slavery in the United States. Okay, so in 1865, the Civil War ended, and 1866, Juneteenth of 1866, General Gardner arrived in Texas and told Texas that the war was over and slavery was ended. And that's now become a national holiday. But there is another important thing about 1866 and the end of the Civil War, and the fact that Texas now knew that the war was over. And that was the cattle industry. Texas is known for its cattle industry. And the drovers, that's the word that was, and it's still used in Australia today. They weren't cowboys and cowgirls. They were drovers, and they would drive these cattle because Texas was a wide open range and a wide open prairie. You had towns popping up as the natives, as the Kiowa and the Comanche were pushed into New Mexico and Arizona or up into Oklahoma, and Texas became more and more civilized. You see these frontier, Chadburn and Fort Griffin and Fort Concho, and they were there and they were extended, and that was part of the United States agreement, was to protect the ranchers and the cattle and the settlers from Indian attack and from outlaw attacks and from all of those dangers of being in West Texas. But there was no railroad in Texas, and beef stretching all across the world. But as Western expansion expanded, there's one thing that followed. Yes, we had the towns pop up. We had the gold towns and the silver towns, and we had all of these areas popping up where there was gambling and drinking and prostitution. And the one thing that they all had in common, there was no law. But what would follow shortly after this was the railroad. And there was one railroad that went down the center of the country. And the rail, starting in St. Louis, there was all kinds of railheads going all kinds of directions in the east, because that's where the Civil War was, and there was all kinds of railroads. But once you got to St. Louis, there was one railroad, and it went through Missouri, it went through Kansas, it went through Colorado, and it went to and ended up in California. In order to meet the need for beef, the Texas ranchers had to bring their beef to the railroad. Railroad in Texas, in West Texas anyway, and it was easier to drive your cattle to Kansas, to Denver, Colorado, to the railhead, so that you could sell your cattle. In 1866, cattle was going at $5 a head. By the end of the cattle driving world in the 1890s, cattle was going in upwards of $100 a head. Your lead drover, the trail boss, would make about $125 a month. The drovers that would make between $25 and $50 a month, depending on the trail, depending on the danger. Okay, so there are two famous trails that come out of Texas. The first is the Chisholm Trail. It started in Fort Griffin, just north of Anson, and it went north into Dodge City, to Topeka, to Wichita, to Abilene, This one started closer to the Odessa area, actually down around San Angelo. And that was the Goodnight Loving Trail. It went through Odessa, went through the Midland, Odessa area, and ended in Denver. Okay, so these Texas cowboys, these Texas drovers, would spend anywhere from 25 days to 100 days driving a herd of cattle. It would take 12 men, sometimes women, but mostly 12 men. A herd of 12 to the railheads in Kansas and Colorado. This is just the way that it was. And all of these towns, like the gold towns and the silver towns, they were all lawless places. And this created another type of bandit, or another type of outlaw. And this was the cattle rustlers. And the cattle rustlers, like Billy the Kid and the Regulators, and Sam Bass, and a ton of different, the cowboys out of Arizona. They're stealing cattle so they can bring them to the railheads and sell them and make money. The other kind of bandit that we've train robber. And the train robbers, especially starting after the Civil War, brought about gangs like the Daltons and Jesse James and the Youngers, and again, Sam Bass and the Wild Bunch with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The Newton Gang, out of the Newton Gang, the Newton boys were out of just south, they were out of Callahan County, Clyde, Texas, a little bit east of Abilene, Texas. These bandits would rob the trains because on these trains was gold and cattle. And primarily they went after the gold. The gold rushes coming out of California to buy the beef in Denver and Kansas, and then also bring the gold back east to the big banks and the big finances. So this created a need or a desire to bring about law enforcement. The U.S. Marshals, granted, you hear about all the U.S. Marshals that are running around. The few of you are researching U.S. Marshals. They really didn't have a whole lot of jurisdiction outside of their district court. Okay? And the court that hired them, the judge that hired them, wherever his jurisdiction was the jurisdiction of the U.S. Marshal. You had the county marshals and the city police, and the Texas Rangers, but their jurisdictions were also limited. So you didn't have anybody, and you had, like the Wild Bunch would rob trains all up and down and all across the United States. They were known, the Wild Bunch were in Idaho and Oregon and in Texas, and they eventually ended up in Bolivia robbing trains and stealing gold. And all of these gangs also had their women that tagged along. Again, how that works. But these Texas cowboys would come off of the range after 25 to 100 days of having no companionship, no money, no excitement in their lives. And they would hit these cow towns in Abilene, in Wichita, Dodge City. And they would go wild. They'd shoot guns, they'd gamble, they'd hire prostitutes, they'd do all of these things. And then you've got so the towns were wild, and you'd have gunfights in the streets. So it was an initiative by the railroad that started a worldwide, countrywide, nationwide attack on crime and demands to clean up the streets. We talked about Seth Bullock and how, the railroad gave him land, and he sold that land or gave that land away to respectable people along the railroad, the right of way of the railroad tracks. And they did this, and they repeatedly did this. The first marshal of Abilene, Kansas was Thomas J. Smith. And these brought about all of the heroes that we've been talking about and all the researchers that you guys are doing. It brought about Bat Masterson and his brother. It brought about the Earps, Wild Bill Hickok, Luke Short, Clay Allison. All of these famous gunmen was at the initiation of and of the railroad to clean up these towns. Well, these guys wouldn't chase bank robbers because they'd leave the jurisdiction. So the railroad, the Union Pacific Railroad, the Illinois Pacific Railroad, started something new. And National Pinkerton Detective Agency. And the Pinkertons were a national private security firm, private detective firm that chased all of these bank robbers all around the countryside. There was no FBI, there was no DEA, there was no nationwide, national-wide law enforcement agency. So companies hired their own. Yeah. And if you talk to a lot of the militia, there still is no constitutional authorization for there is no constitutional authorization for a nationwide police force. So, but the Pinkertons had jurisdiction. They were a private security firm that went around. They went looking for. They were bounty hunters. They went hunting bad guys, and they worked primarily for the railroads. Then, in the 1860s, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the Secret Service started hiring people out of the Pinkerton Agency. And the Secret Service started working in the West. But they were primarily focused on controlling counterfeiting and protecting the president and protecting the country from treason. But it was the railroads that started and brought civilization. So I'm going to end this here. Piece of housekeeping. I want you to have your original post by Friday so other people can participate and they can make comments on your posts. We can't all be hanging out on Sunday waiting for you to post so that we can talk to you. I'm tired of asking you. I've been asking you, and starting today, I am taking points. If you are not posting till Saturday and Sunday, I'm taking points away from you. I want your original post in Canvas by Friday. There, I'll see you in the forums. I'll see you in the discussions. Have a great week.